Well, good morning. This is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page. Hope everyone is doing well today. Hey, Gail and Linda, good to see you guys on here. There are others who are on the stream not commenting. Hey, Wayne, good to see you this morning. Hope you're doing well. All right, Lyle, Anita, and Roger, and Connie, good to see everybody joining in today. We started our study of the book of Daniel yesterday, and we're going to pick that up again today. Obviously, we're going to be in Daniel chapter 1, so let me pull up our PowerPoint here. Trying to use PowerPoint, and that can be very helpful, hearing, but also seeing what we're talking about. Help you follow along a little bit. All right, Daniel chapter 1. Well, here, we'll just do this. Here's what we covered yesterday. We looked yesterday at the people and dates of the book. It's extremely important to understand the historical context, know who we're dealing with, the people that we're talking about. I'll tell you another important and interesting study to me is the names of the individuals. We looked at all that yesterday and the definitions of their names. Basically, I went through looked at each main character, if you will, of the book of Daniel, told you what their name meant, and that helps us set a date so we can appreciate the historical setting. And so as we get today into Daniel chapter 1, we are going to be introduced to exactly what's going on here and set the stage for the rest of the book. So as I told you yesterday, hey, Diana and Brian, good to see you guys on here today. As I told you yesterday, we're in about 606 BC. We're told it's the third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim. And he came into power in 609 BC. He reigned until 598 BC. He had 11 years. You can read about Jehoiakim in 2 Kings 24, 2 Chronicles chapter 36. And he's one of those evil kings. And this is the time when Israel, actually the southern tribe of Israel, known as Judah, goes into Babylonian captivity, something they had been warned about since the days of Moses. For quite literally, about 900 years, they had been told, if you do not follow the covenant, you're going to be taken away. And in fact, we're going to read about that here in just a minute. But we start in Daniel 1, verse 1. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Of course, besiegement. What does that mean? Those cities, important cities, were protected. Back in those days, they were walled, gated cities. We're not used to seeing that today, but that was a source of protection. Also, oftentimes, those cities would be on the most elevated place in the region, so they could see any approaching enemy. So when a foreign power, when an enemy would besiege you, they would basically lock you into your own city. They would surround the walls. They would build what's called siege mounds. They would build mounds so they could get over the wall and come in and attack. Or they would tear the wall down, which incidentally Babylon did both. They built mounds around the city, but they also tore the city down. So they are besieging the city. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, Nebuchadnezzar's hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. So here's what I want to do just real quick. I'm going to go back to Deuteronomy chapter 28 and notice a very detailed, very specific prophecy of what we see being fulfilled in Daniel chapter 1. Now again, this is in these words that we're going to read here are from the days of Moses, about 1500 BC, so about 900 years prior to what we're reading in Daniel chapter 1. Let me see, Deuteronomy 28, and I'm going to start in verse 49. It says, "The Lord will bring a nation against you from afar, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flies, a nation whose language you will not understand." And I talked about that yesterday, and it'll actually come out in Daniel chapter 1 again today. A nation whose language you will not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, which does not respect the elderly nor show favor to the young. And they shall eat the increase of your livestock and the produce of your land until you are destroyed. They shall not leave you grain or new wine or oil, or the increase of your cattle or the offspring of your flocks, until they have destroyed you. They shall besiege you at all your gates. Of course, we just read that in Daniel 1 and verse 1. Until your high and fortified walls, in which you trust, come down throughout all your land, and they shall besiege you at all your gates throughout all your land, which the Lord your God has given you. Listen to this. You shall eat the fruit of your own body, the flesh of your sons and your daughters, whom the Lord your God has given you, in the siege and desperate straits, in which your enemy shall distress you. Cannibalism. They're locked inside their cities. All right, the produce, all that, typically we're outside of the city walls. If you're locked in for an extended period of time, what are you going to eat? Well, we're told here they'd eat their children. You can read 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 24 through 29, and you'll read something about that. Now, that's not in connection with the book of Daniel here, but it's another instance of that taking place. Hey, Sharon from Orlando, good to see you on here today. And so here in Daniel chapter 1, in the first two verses, this is the time, and these are the events that are taking place. And like I said, it's been prophesied about for approximately 900 years. Verses beginning in verse 3 down through verse 7, so Jerusalem's been taken, captives have been taken. Beginning in verse 3. It says, Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, this is King Nebuchadnezzar, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel, and some of the king's descendants, and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had the ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. Remember back there in Deuteronomy chapter 28, he said it's going to be a foreign group of people whose language you do not speak. Well, some of these captives, and this was very common practice, these captives would be taken to a foreign land, and the very best, as we might say, the cream of the crop, were picked out, and they would be used for the benefit of the captor. That's what happens with Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, as their Hebrew names are called. And so they are some of these select people who are chosen. They're good looking, they're smart, they can be trained in all of these different ways. The king appointed for them daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. They are going to inundate these captives with Chaldean culture, even down to the food that they ate. Now that's going to be a problem, which Daniel and his friends will have to face and deal with. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. I touched on this a bit yesterday, but this was, so you and I are sitting here in 2021, and we're reading of these historical events, things that happened, and I think we should really take time to grasp the severity, the cruelty of the Babylonian captors, what they were doing. Now, Daniel and his three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were faithful servants of God. There's no question about that. But they are suffering right along with the unrighteous people, people like King Jehoiakim. This is his captivity, as it's told here. He was an evil king, and there was much evil that was taking place in the nation of Israel. That's why they're taken captive. But the righteous are suffering right along with these evil people. There are extensive consequences to wickedness. So these four from the sons of Judah are taken to serve. And then it says that Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. As you know, the nation of Israel, the law of Moses had some very specific dietary laws. You can go to Leviticus, Leviticus, I think, chapter 13, that talks about those dietary laws. They were not going to violate those laws. They were taken from their homeland. They were taken from the temple. The temple was destroyed. But Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were still God's people. And they could still remain faithful to the covenant. Location and circumstance does not change the necessity of being faithful. And that same thing is true for us today. The child of God today, the Christian today, can live under any circumstance, in any location, and live faithfully for God. Our outward circumstances do not determine our faithfulness. All right, so we see that here with Daniel. He purposed, that is, he put in place, he had predetermined what he was going to do. And so how does he do that? Because again, he's a captive. All right, he's been taken away. So how is he going to, make this request to the prince of the eunuchs? Well, look at verse 9. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. We are not told how that happened. Some people say that, or they refer to Daniel as the second Joseph. Not that he was literally Joseph, but we see the same type of dedication to God. We see the same type of faithfulness. You remember Daniel, of course, was sold into captivity Joseph was sold into captivity by his brothers, and he became a servant in Egypt. But you see the same type of determination and purpose in Joseph and in Daniel, and in both instances, God brings them into favor. You can read Genesis 39 and verse 21, where Joseph, we're told, was brought into the favor of the prison keeper. Daniel here now is brought into the favor of his captors. This is God's providence. There's nothing miraculous taking place here. This is God, as we say, working behind the scenes, working behind the curtains. We see Daniel's purpose, and we see God's working all the way through the end of Daniel chapter 1. And it's important to set this stage because of the rest of the book, because of Daniel's role with Nebuchadnezzar, because of Daniel's role with other people, Darius, Cyrus, that we read about yesterday. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed you your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. He's kind of, the chief of the eunuchs here is kind of hesitant to meet Daniel's request, because it's his job to get these guys suited for service in the Chaldean court. All right, going back up to verse, beginning in verse 3 there. His job is to make these Jewish captives Babylonians, to train them, change their language, change their source of education. And now Daniel's making this request, but because of God's favor, because of the providence of God, this thing happens. He said, I tell you what, give me 10 days. This is Daniel's request. They're there for 3 years to be trained, as we've already read. He says, give me 10 days, let us follow our dietary laws, and then compare us to everybody else who's going to do what Nebuchadnezzar requires of you. Down verse 13, let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies, and as you see fit, so deal with your servants. Daniel's handling himself very wisely here. He's being respectful to his captor. Just give us a chance. Week and a half. So at the end of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portions of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion and delicacies, and the wine that they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. He put them on Daniel's diet because it worked. All right, let's talk about eunuchs for just a minute. What is a eunuch? Well, basically, these guys here, again, captives in a foreign land, who were going to be used for the purposes of their captor. Well, good afternoon, Patricia from Wales, United Kingdom. Wow. How about that? Well, glad you're on here today, Patricia. So a eunuch, basically you look up this term, whether you're looking it up in the Hebrew language or in the Greek language, means an emasculated male. Castration, okay? It was often the case, and we see this particularly in the book of Esther, that a eunuch was kind of, I guess you'd say kind of the housekeeper, kind of the guardian of the house for a king or for somebody important. Oftentimes they would watch over a wife or the family, or women in general. That you'll read about, when you read about eunuchs, you'll read about a king's harem. Well, if you castrate a male, there won't be any issues there. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were, most people believe, I don't think we're ever exactly told that they were made eunuchs, but they were placed under the oversight of a eunuch. And so the assumption then, I think safely, is that they were put in that position. And again, that just shows you, that illustrates the brutality of these captors, all right, of these foreign invaders. So they're put on their own diet, they're given 10 days, and it works out. And their keeper, the prince of the eunuchs, says, all right, I'm changing everybody's diet to be like God's, rather like Daniel's. So then you get to verse 17, it says, as for these young men, God gave them knowledge. Now, if you remember verses 3 and 4 here, it was the Chaldeans who were going to re-educate them and then assimilate them into Chaldean culture. Well, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. And you'll notice the emphasis there, and that plays an important role in the rest of the book. Daniel was given this wisdom to interpret visions and dreams. In fact, that'll come into play right in the very next chapter. So at the end of the days, this is the end of the 3 years where Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were trained, re-educated. When the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And again, I cannot help but connect that to verse 9 and the providence of God. God's people are in captivity because that's what they deserved. They broke the covenant. They were unfaithful to God. But even in that terrible condition, you have faithful people like Daniel and his 3 friends, and you have the working of God who put them in a position of influence and power. And again, you will see that influence and power throughout this book. And so they serve before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in his realm. Why? Well, because God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. Verse 17. The providence of God. That's what we're reading about here. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. And then, of course, we understand, Cyrus became, I guess you'd say the dominant, the Persians in about 539 BC or so. Of course, it was King Cyrus who permitted the Jews to return to Jerusalem in 536. We read about that as you open the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and see those things taking place here. But Daniel's going to have an influential role, not only in the Chaldeans with the Babylonians, but also then with the Persians and Cyrus and Darius and all these kings that we read about yesterday. So that's Daniel chapter 1. That sets the stage for us. We understand that God's people are in this condition. They are in this position of captivity and punishment, but it's their own doing. Again, you read, I tell you what, let me do this just real quick. I'm going to go to 2 Kings 24 and read just a couple of verses there that point out what I'm saying here about why the Israelites were in this position. So the end of 2 Kings 23 talks about the reign of King Jehoiakim and the fact that he was evil. And then 2 Kings 24 begins this way. In his days, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came up, and Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years. A vassal, V-A-S-S-A-L. This is somebody who paid taxes Basically, he was under jurisdiction of Babylon. So then he rebelled against him. And the Lord sent against him raiding bands of Chaldeans, bands of Syrians and Moabites, and the people of Ammon. He sent them against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord which he had spoken by his prophets. Surely at the commandment of the Lord this came upon Judah, to remove them from his sight because of the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he had done, and also because of the innocent blood that he had shed, for he had filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, which the Lord would not pardon. That gives us, again, a little insight as to why they are in captivity. Why would God let such evil things happen to his people? Well, because of sin, and not only because of the sins of Manasseh, but when you look at the history of Israel as a kingdom, it goes back to their first king under the divided kingdom, Jeroboam. Idolatry, unfaithfulness to God, it's been going on for hundreds of years. And so God told them, if you do this, here's what's going to happen. You're going to be taken away from your homeland, and you're going to go somewhere you've never been. You don't know the language, and you don't know the people. That's where Daniel is. But even though all of that is the case, God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the Babylonians, and he's going to use that. That's Daniel chapter 1, guys. Tomorrow is Daniel chapter 2. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he needs an interpretation. So we will look at that tomorrow. Long chapter, but we'll divide it up into 4 or 5 different sections and study that together. I appreciate all of you being on here today. I don't see any questions or comments. Just looking here real quick. Yeah, don't see any questions or comments. Appreciate you being on here today. You're welcome, Roger and Anita. Hope you all have a good day, and I hope to see you back here tomorrow at 11 o'clock, and we will study Daniel chapter 2. Have a good day.